Hi, boys and girls. I'm so excited that you're back with me again today to study another lesson in God's Word. Today we're in the book of Exodus, and we're going to see where God opens up the Red Sea so the Israelites can pass through it to escape Pharaoh's army. Isn't it amazing, the power of God? If you remember from our last lesson that Moses warned Pharaoh that if he did not let the children of Israel leave Egypt, that God was going to bring a 10th plague upon them, a horrible plague, where the firstborn son of every household in Egypt was going to die. This made Pharaoh angry, and he told Moses, "Get away from me. I never want to see you again." Well, Moses said, "Well, you've spoken well, because you will never see my face again." And he doesn't. That night, at midnight, every person, whether they were Egyptian or an Israelite or from any other country that may have been living there, everyone who did not have the blood on the doorpost and the lintel of their houses and had not done the other things that God had commanded them to do to prepare for that night, the firstborn son died. And it came to pass at midnight, the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Egypt who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. They had already lost most of their livestock because God had brought a plague on them. Every one of them that was not housed in the barns would die. All the ones that were out in the open. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house that one was not dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Rise, go from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go and serve your Lord." There's an interesting verse in Psalms chapter 105 talking about this, and it says, "He also brought them out with silver and gold, and there was," what? "None feeble among his tribes." That's amazing. God had been preparing them to travel on foot for hundreds of miles. About 300 miles is what they would have had to have traveled. And there was not one that was not able to walk. There was not a one that was so feeble that he had to be carried by someone else. Other versions say there was none that stumbled among his tribes. They were sure-footed and strong enough to walk. And Egypt was glad when they departed, for the fear of them had fallen upon them. And he spread a cloud for a covering, a fire to give light in the night. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they granted them whatever they requested. So every Israelite that asked of the Egyptians for their silver and gold and their fine materials, they just wanted to be rid of the Israelites. They gave them whatever they asked for. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. They carried as much as they could carry out of Egypt with them. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children, besides the women. Now, I want to give you some kind of perspective on this. The population of all the men in the Quad Cities in this area just totals 14,000. That's all the men in Florence and Muscle Shoals and Tuscumbia and Sheffield. A total of 14,000. Now, can you imagine how many people that would be? 600,000 men, not counting their children and all the women, and not counting something else. In verse 38, a mixed multitude went up with them also. Now, what do you think a mixed multitude that went with them was? Anybody who wanted to go with them and be saved that night from the death of the firstborn son, if they had done what God commanded them to do with the blood on the doorpost and the other things, God welcomed them to go with the Israelites. You see, God always invites everyone of every nation, all over the world. He always has. He welcomes them to come to him and to be his people. You didn't have to just be an Israelite to go. And a great deal of livestock went with them. Now it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants turned against the people, the Israelites. And they said, "Why have we done this? What in the world did we do that we have let Israel go from serving us?" They had just lost every bit of their free slave labor. They were wondering, what in the world came over us? So, in verse 9 of chapter 14, so the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them camping by the sea. Can you imagine the fear that was struck into their hearts when they saw Pharaoh's army coming after them? And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and they cried out to the Lord. Why were they so afraid when it was probably 1.5 million of them, maybe 2 million of them? Because they had no weapons, and none of them had been trained to be soldiers. They had been slaves. So they had nothing to fight with. But they had one weapon, and that was God. That's all they needed. And Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand still and see the power of the Lord. He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever." It'll be over. And the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, behind the Israelites. They got the Red Sea here and Pharaoh's army behind them. So the pillar of cloud goes behind them and went before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all that night. The Egyptians, they couldn't come near the Israelites all that night because of the big, huge pillar of fire and the cloud that separated the two of them. They were in darkness, even though the pillar of fire was between them. They couldn't see because it was also a cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the children of Israel to go forward, but lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on muddy ground, in ankle-deep water? No, on dry ground through the midst of the sea. Now, isn't that amazing? He parts the Red Sea, and they are going to cross it on dry ground. Wow. In verse 22, it says, So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Now, that took a lot of faith. I cannot imagine how afraid they had to have been to walk between those huge walls of water. Man. And in the New Testament, you'll see that God had a cloud covering them. So they were covered by water on both sides and a cloud above them. They could not see anything except the way to go forward. Cannot imagine their fear. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea. All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. All of them. Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. Oh, what do you think that means? He troubled them. Well, it says what it means. And he took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. Yeah, can you imagine? Think about your parents trying to drive your family car with just 2 wheels on it. Or maybe it just has 3 wheels on it. Or maybe 2 wheels on it. It'd be impossible. Well, he caused their chariot wheels to come off their chariots, so their horses are just dragging them on their chariots. And the Egyptians said, Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. And they're calling God Lord, Master. It's a shame that he wasn't their God. Then the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots, and on their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then when the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them, not so much as one of them remained. So every horseman that chased after them into the sea was drowned. It must have been almost every single one of them. And boys and girls, I want you to think how God left Egypt devastated. You remember when Joseph was living in Egypt, he's the one that made Egypt the richest nation in the entire world. But they didn't give God credit for it years later. They didn't know Joseph, didn't know his God, didn't want to know him. So, since they did not honor God, God left their land devastated. They, at that time, were the richest and most powerful nation in the entire world. They had every other country bow their knees to them. They were so powerful. Now, all the fish was killed in the Nile River. Remember when he turned it to blood? Well, that killed everything that was in the Nile River. And they depended on that for food. All the trees were stripped and broken down. Their pomegranate trees, whatever fruit trees that they had, were stripped and broken down. Their crops were destroyed, leaving them without grain for food. Because whatever the hailstorm and the other things didn't destroy, the locusts did. Their cattle and their livestock were killed. All the cattle and livestock that were not contained within barns or buildings that were outside, not under shelter, died. Their silver, gold, and fine materials, so much of it was gone. The worst thing, their firstborn sons were dead. The firstborn of what livestock they had left was dead. Their great chariots, weapons, and army was destroyed in the Red Sea. All their slaves were gone, and their great reputation in the world was destroyed. The whole world came to know that God destroyed them. So Pharaoh had to go back to his throne broken. Oh, the power of God. In Exodus, the 14th chapter, in verse 31, it says, "Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses." Boys and girls, when you believe all of those great miracles, oh, it's a shame that all the Egyptians did not believe. You know, the Bible will show us that the Egyptians, or the mixed multitude that leave with Moses, they come to be a bad influence on the children of Israel. And we'll see that in the next lesson. No, it'll be 2 lessons from now. Our next lesson is going to be about what the New Testament says about this Red Sea crossing. Do you know that in 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, verses 1 and 2, it tells us that when the people passed through the Red Sea, they were also covered with a cloud. So they had water on both sides of them, and a cloud covered them as they crossed. And God baptized them. We're going to have a lesson showing what that meant to the people when they were baptized, how they were changed. I hope you'll join me again for that lesson. And I hope you learned something from this lesson. The power of God and the intelligence of following God and serving Him, obeying Him. Thank you for joining me again, and I hope you will join me again for the next one. Teachers, the clip art and gifts come from Google Images and freebibleimages.org. And I appreciate Sweet Publishing Company for providing these for us at no charge. I hope you'll join me again next week. Bye-bye.